Hello, my name is Ryan, and I'm excited to bring you another book review, but this time it is of a very daunting novel, a novel that you have all heard of, undoubtedly, and perhaps you've read it, and if you've read it, I would love to hear your opinion down in the comments, and whether you have not read it, that's okay too. I'm going to tell you that it was a novel that I quite enjoyed, but I haven't revealed the name yet, have I? The name of this novel is War and Peace. Written by Tolstoy. You always hear War and Peace is very thick. Now it looks moderately thick, but if you look at my version, the words, the print is extraordinarily small print, small type, and very hefty book. It tops at a 690 something pages in this. I believe if this was in another print, I would not doubt that it would reach over 1,000 pages. So it's a big book. We've all heard War and Peace is a big book. We all heard that it's a very influential novel. Who hasn't heard of Tolstoy's War and Peace? And I had heard of it, and I had bought this years ago. It's part of the Great Books collection. This was in collaboration between the Encyclopedia Britannica and the University of Chicago. In the middle of the 20th century, they put out the 100 most important books to understand Western culture. And so I had gotten this several years ago. It had been sitting on my shelf, and I had been telling myself that one of these days I would get around to reading it, and I finally did. Now, why didn't I read it earlier? Because perhaps like you, if you haven't picked it up but have thought about it, I was intimidated. I thought, War and Peace. It's one of those classic novels that you imagine is not going to be easy. At least it will be very long. What am I going to get myself involved with? So I've put it off. But then I really enjoyed also another author that I put off, Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, and I really enjoyed that. So I said, well, let's continue on the Russian train. Plus, Russia's in the news all the time these days. And so I thought, well, maybe this will give me some insight on what's going on in Eastern Europe, at least with the people, their national temperament, and war itself. War is a constant theme throughout the generations of humanity, and so to understand that, and peace, let's not forget about peace, to see how these two topics are dealt with by Tolstoy, who is considered one of the greatest authors of the 19th century. So, I want to say first and foremost, if you are like me, or how I was, and you're daunted, you don't want to read Tolstoy's War and Peace, let me assure you that it was a very enjoyable story. It was so enjoyable that I got hooked to it, and I thought, why did I wait so long? Tolstoy's War and Peace, I'm going to talk a lot. This is going to be a long video, so bear with me. Tolstoy's War and Peace is it's a grand epic about the Napoleonic Wars that took place between the Republic of France and Russia in the early 1800s. It spans roughly about 20 years. The main novel, a little less than that, maybe 10 years. And then in the epilogue, there's 2 epilogues. I'll get to that later on. There's many different characters. You go through the transformations that they take throughout their lives. Some characters rise through the social hierarchy. Some characters fall. Some characters die. Some characters give birth to new members of their family. Some characters find love. Some characters don't. Some characters are rejected. You have all of the various manifestations of life, of human life, in all of these characters. And you will find people in this novel that you will love. Like, I love most of them. There were some characters who are obviously a little less morally questionable, but even them, I found points of compassion and sympathy, because they're all human. So I just want to say that besides, and I'm going to get into sort of some of the philosophical side of the novel, In the story is rich. It's beautiful. It's funny. It's enlightening. There's nuggets of wisdom. There's great depth to the psychology of the characters, in my opinion. And I loved it. Now, not every author is for everyone. So maybe you're someone who won't like it. But I got to say that I did, if I'm going to be honest. And I liked it from the first chapter. Sometimes it takes a while, especially with really big books, it takes a while for the author to get the events going and to become attached to some of the characters. But I found myself laughing and being very interested in what was going on and how the developments were occurring throughout the story right in the first couple chapters. So it was not tedious. It did take me about 4 weeks to read it, 3-4 weeks to read it. 1 to 2 hours a day, sometimes more, sometimes less. I'm not a fast reader. I'm a careful reader. I read through at the pace that is enjoyable. I feel that reading, more than enlightenment, more than checking off a box like saying, I read Tolstoy's War and Peace, even though I did want to check that box off, I want to enjoy my experience. Literature is for pleasure and enlightenment and all that, and education. Secondary, in my opinion. So the story's fantastic. I'll talk about some of the characters as I'm going on, but I also want to let you know that throughout the story, Tolstoy presents, not throughout the entire story, but at certain key chapters, usually when a book is starting, and particularly at the very end of the novel, in fact, it is the second epilogue. He goes into sort of a diatribe on the argument between free will and determinism. Or he calls it, what does he call it? Some other word. It'll come to me. But basically, he is trying to convince you. He's trying to argue to you that if we really had knowledge of every single factor that goes into all of our actions, then we would see that a lot of us are not as free as we think we are. And he uses the events that take place in these Napoleonic Wars that happened in Russia, obviously mostly told, almost completely, except for a few parts, told from the Russian side, that these generals, these emperors, and Napoleon himself, and these dukes, and the officers, and he goes down to the sergeants and the soldiers, are less free than you think. So there's a lot of food for thought throughout this very enjoyable story. Now, when I say enjoyable story, I'm not to say that it's all love, peace, and roses, because there's no enjoyable story without a little drama, and there's plenty of drama. There's battles where people die, where it gets very bloody and gory. It's not like watching Saving Private Ryan where you're seeing guts spill out, but if you have a fertile imagination, Tolstoy does a very excellent job of bringing these battles to life. And you'll learn a lot about how these battles were fought, how they were organized. I found that alone fascinating, what it means to be a soldier, what it means to be an officer, why do people sign up for wars, what makes an army victorious on the field of battle, what is bravery. There's one part where I think it's Nicholas Rostov, who's one of the main characters, and forgive me if I mispronounce any of these Russian names. He's considered brave. He gets like a medal for bravery, but he was running away just for the fact that he got bloodied in the battle, and he ran away. He was given an award for bravery, and so he's like, "Is this bravery?" A lot of things. We sort of glorify soldiers and war, and sure enough, this book will give you an appreciation for soldiers, but it will also show the other side, how many warriors will make false claims about their bravery and lie and exaggerate their exploits and adventures. But of course, I think we could safely say that that's a human characteristic, not something only for soldiers. and something that goes across the broad spectrum of society. Okay, so yeah, back to the philosophical side on free will and determinism, which I believe he called. I can't come to the word. It starts with an I. Anyways, do we have free will? Well, he uses these battles and then he goes into the details of why this general chose not to fight Napoleon on that day. Sounds boring, right? But when you get so attached to these battles and why the battle didn't get fought, and all of this is historically accurate for the most part. I did fact check some of it, and like some of the more unbelievable things that had happened, like there was this one part where two French officers managed to lie and win a battle just with their lies, and they took over this bridge by convincing the enemy army that they were just coming to inspect it, or they just told some fibs, and they ended up winning it. It was so unbelievable. I thought no author would write this and anyone would ever believe it. And then I looked it up, and sure enough, it's like one of the top 10 mistakes or blunders in military history, and it was true. So Tolstoy, from the brief biography that I read, had spent many years, and many of his best years, where he spent most of his time working on this novel. He did a ton of research and put his life force into it, and this was the book that really cemented him in Russia's history. His story, the story of Tolstoy's life, is very interesting as well, from what I know. Maybe I'll talk about that a little bit later. So you are going to learn a lot about history. You're going to learn a lot about war. You're going to learn a lot about psychology. You're going to learn a lot about love, about death, about friendship, about family, as well as how people lived during good times and hard times. Because when there was peace, people are doing their thing. They're gossiping in parlors. They're riding sleighs in the snow, enjoying the enchanting stars. But when they're in war, things become tough. They start eating horse flesh. They start seeing morally questionable things, like soldiers being ordered to kill prisoners who perhaps didn't even deserve it, who perhaps didn't even have a fair trial. And then they have to internally deal with that. And so there's even some sort of mental crack-ups where the characters are so shocked and traumatized by the things that they have seen, and you really feel it. Like, I would be traumatized if I went through some of these experiences, and then how they heal later on or don't heal. Because obviously our soul and our body are connected, our mind, our body. And when you have really bad mental health, sometimes that can lead to deleterious effects on your physical health. I know that personally, not going to get into that. But there was a character, one of my favorite, Andrew Bolkonsky, I forget, Prince Andrew. And so because it's such a long novel, and even though there's so many characters, you follow a lot of these main characters and you see how they develop. Either they become more open and loving with the world, or they become more closed and cynical. And Andrew is a very interesting character because he had a lot of hard things happen. Even though he was a very valorous soldier and really did his duty for the Russian Empire, he got overlooked when it came to promotion time, and a lot of other people who didn't deserve it got promotions just because they knew how to be political. I'm sure perhaps you have someone at your job who has a better position than you, and not because they're smarter or more able, but because they know how to suck up to the boss, right? We all know that story. So this character, he gets passed up, he gets injured, gets left for dead, comes home, his wife dies, he's got a kid, his father's an asshole. I mean, he gets all of these hard shocks to him, and he just sort of closes up, and he just sort of, fuck it, not going to have love in this world. I'm just going to live because I'm not going to commit suicide. And I'm just not going to cause any harm. And then suddenly life sprang back into his life because he met one of his old friends who was so happy and he said the right things. And so I think one of my favorite parts of this novel is that sort of redemption, that even when you've gone through really hard times, even when someone has wronged you so badly, someone has cheated on your wife, someone has ruined your marriage, someone has killed someone in front of your eyes, and you're closed off, you think the world's terrible, you think you're terrible, you think life's awful, and then suddenly life finds a way to open your heart again, allow you to love, and allow you to come out into the world. And so he had a bit. He was one of the characters. I don't want to spoil too much, so I won't say exactly what happened to Andrew. Same thing with female characters. There's a female character who makes a big mistake, ends up shattered from it, loses her looks, loses her youth, sort of from all of this mental anguish that she goes through for a mistake that she made, goes to religion, and that's pretty typical, right? A lot of people do go to religion if you weren't born into it, but later on in life, you have a lot of bad things happen to you. Sometimes we do go to religion because it provides sort of a structure that will allow us to forgive ourselves or at least make sense of everything. And then this female character, Natasha, I'm talking about, who was so full of life, is the belle of the ball before she started getting into this sort of cycle of guilt and remorse that sort of withered her health. And then suddenly something happened and she started to sing again and the life started to come into her again. And so there's this cycle of not only war and peace, that's how the novel goes. There's a war in 1806 and then there's peace and then there's a war in, 1809 or 1808 and then finally 1812, 1813. But it goes war, peace, and in these characters' lives, there's sort of like hope, despair, or life, I want to live, and I want to die, so life, death. There's a lot of these rhythms that are real. You'll go through this if you pay attention probably to your own inner state, Some days you're filled with life, and some days you're closed off from the world, and then the whole world, or at least at that part of the world, Europe, even though it's a small part of the world, really, was going through this life and death, and very cyclical. And you'll learn, like I said, about history. I found that fascinating. I didn't know a lot about Napoleon, but I found myself, while I wasn't reading the book, researching about Napoleon and how his rise to power, about the French Revolution. So it's great. It's great because, reading a history books also can be very enjoyable, but reading history, like in actual historical facts, these things happen. A lot of the characters that were historical characters, they were portrayed exactly, historically accurately, at least concerning the facts and the battles and treaties and things like that and letters that they wrote. But a lot of the other characters that Tolstoy created, I think very believable characters, and the history comes to life because Tolstoy breathed so much of his creativity and life into these characters. So I don't know what else I want to say. Oh yeah. So I'm not going to spoil what happens, but if you know history, you probably at least know what happens between the Russians and the French, but you'll learn a lot more interesting tidbits if you're not a professional historian. But at the end of the novel, there are two epilogues. The first epilogue takes place sort of like 10 years after all of the main events that happen in the meat of the novel. So if you've ever watched a movie and the hero marries the heroine and they get married and that's the end of the movie, and then suddenly in the credits, it has 10 years later, they have 5 kids and they're on a beach in Jamaica, or so-and-so starts a new business or whatever. You know what I'm talking about at the end of the movie? Because you're always wondering, wow, that was such a great movie. I wonder what happened to those characters. I wonder if they stay friends. Well, that's what happens in the first epilogue. It's a pretty decent size, and you revisit these characters and their lives, and some of them have developed in very interesting ways, and it was very nice and pleasant to kind of find out what happens to these characters later on. And then the second epilogue, like I said, is also really meaty. And this was actually probably the only part of the novel that I didn't enjoy. This was purely philosophical on, see, now I'm going to look up that word, between free will and maybe I'm not going to look it up because I'm doing a video and you don't have time. Also power, it talks about power. So okay, so yeah, I'm glad I opened this because I probably would have forgot this and I wouldn't be able to do this review without mentioning this. So when he's talking about free will versus determinism, and you know what that is, free will, you feel like you could do whatever you want. I could have an apple right now, I could have an orange, I can go for a run, or I can stay home. And the other argument is that no, you actually don't. There's so many things happening to you, not only your genetics, but the events outside. We're limited. Our freedom is so limited. We don't even realize how limited it is. And if we could know all of the forces that were impacting us, then we would see that, of course, you had to go for that run. You couldn't have stayed inside because of X, Y, and Z. So that's free will versus determinism. And he uses this throughout the meat of the novel, mostly to talk about war, why the battles had to take place in this way, why this general had to take place. Because you get the feeling that Tolstoy really was dissatisfied with historians' depictions of certain generals or Napoleon and how the war was won. He felt that these were completely fabricated narratives that might satisfy a child, but anyone who had any sort of deep understanding of nature and law would dismiss, because even though it is nice to just say, okay, why did France go to war with Russia? Oh, because Napoleon wanted to. Okay, that makes sense. It makes sense to you, probably. It made sense to me. But he says, no. He had to do it because he did. We don't know why. There's so many factors out there controlling it. The soldiers wanted to go, the will of the people. And he even goes to say that people like Napoleon or people like Emperor Alexander, another major figure at that time, are less free than the people at the bottom. So I'm probably not doing a great job of this, of explaining it. I'll probably have to read some of these sections again. But it is a very deep philosophical treatise on free will versus determinism. And I still haven't come up with that word, but let's forget it. As well as power. What is power? Because power is often the word that historians use to describe the impetus that moves peoples and nations through the course of history. So he's a critic of history, and I should say particularly the type of history that attributes the big changes in humanity and the big changes in the world stage and politics and nations, when they attribute that to the power of individuals. And I should also mention, I believe Tolstoy's War and Peace came out in the 1860s. And 2 or 3 decades before that, there was a very influential book by Thomas Carlyle, a Scottish historian and essayist, who gave a bunch of lectures and then eventually wrote them into a book called Heroes and Hero Worship. Something along those lines. Thomas Carlyle, friend of Ralph Waldo Emerson, wrote this book on heroes and hero worship, where he describes how history is shaped by heroes, shaped by geniuses, people like Luther, people like Rousseau, so whether they're intellectuals, whether they're priests, whether they're kings, and he uses Napoleon as an example. Very influential book. I believe it was even required reading in many schools in the Western world for a very long time. So Tolstoy started fighting back against that. I don't want to turn you off from the story itself, whether or not you even care about the argument between free will and determinism. Whether you care that humanity was shaped by heroes or it was just shaped by all of these innumerable factors and just had to happen the way that it happened if you had infinite knowledge and infinite time to examine all of it. Whether you're into that, and some of you might be, I was a little interested in that, moderately interested, I should say. The story is so good and the history is so good and that's not the biggest part of it. The philosophical treatises is not the bulk of the novel. The bulk of the novel is the story, and it's really, really good. But Tolstoy really wanted to punch back at Carlyle, who he disagreed with. And I guess free will and determinism is a very interesting topic. Do you feel like you're free, or do you feel like when you look back at your life, you go, why did I do that? I should have done, no, wait, I couldn't have done anything different because I was there thinking this and I had that for breakfast. So of course I did that. Do you feel like you had free will in all of your past actions, or do you feel like you had to do what you had to do? Very interesting thought, but we're going to save that for another day. I'll wrap off by saying that Tolstoy's War and Peace is a fantastic book. Whatever version you get, I'm sure there are better translators than others. Obviously, translation is its own art. Mine was translated by Luis and Aylmer Maude, the Encyclopedia Britannica version. Tolstoy's War and Peace, Volume 51 of the Great Books series, and I'm very happy I read it, and I'm very happy to talk to you about it. I hope that you like this story. If you read it, let me know what you think about it. And if you have read it, let me know. And if you don't want to read it, tell me why. Okay, that's it for today. My name's Ryan.